Most so-called possession cases are unsettling, but this one tonight is on another level. It wasn't just somebody thrashing in bed, speaking in strange voices. No, in this case, objects appeared inside the woman's body. Nails forced their way out of her skull. Her home became the center of violent poltergeist activity. It sounds like folklore and hearsay, I know, but this was recorded in a written report backed up by multiple witnesses, including a doctor, town mayor, and other respected locals. Thanks to a small team of German viewers of Into the Fog, we've been able to work through the original German report and translate it, and now present to you the horrifying story of Gottliebin Dittus. She was a young woman from 19th century Germany whose 2-year-long battle with the supernatural left her village shaken to its core, and is still talked about today. This case may be well known in Germany. Indeed, tourists can visit the house in which it all took place, but I am amazed that it's barely getting any attention in the rest of the world, because this is an astonishing story. But I need to warn you, hold tight for a relentless case packed with moments of horror you may struggle to forget. I'm Peter Laws, and you're about to encounter pure nightmare fuel and the terrifying exorcism of Gottliebin Dittus. The horrifying events that you are about to hear are found in a remarkable written report by a Lutheran pastor called Johann Christoph Blumhardt. His encounter with the paranormal almost overwhelmed him, and he wondered if it might be best to never speak of it again. And yet his religious superiors insisted that he write it all down, and so he did. Its title, An Account of Gottliebin Dittus's Illness, belies the epic supernatural battle you'll find within its pages. Born in 1805, Johann came from a long line of craftspeople in southwest Germany, but his eyes were more often on the heavens. By the time he was 12, he had read the Bible twice, and as a boy he marveled at the great acts of power that he found within the pages of Scripture, the miracles, the angels, the demons, and yet, as he grew into adulthood, he longed to see such supernatural evidence in the world around him. But he struggled to sense the active power of the supernatural in his daily life. That would change. After studying theology, mathematics, history, and philosophy at Tübingen University, he worked as a teacher in Switzerland and then as a junior clergyman back in Germany, where he met his future wife. But it was when he reached the age of 33, the same age Jesus died, that he moved to the small rural village of Möttlingen. This was where he took up the role as the new church pastor. And Johann arrived in Möttlingen on Tuesday, July 31st, 1838. The locals gathered to welcome him, and at the time there were 874 souls in this parish. Most of them, 535 in fact, lived in Möttlingen itself, but the rest were in another village, which was part of the parish called Haugstedt. The locals were a tough crowd, to be honest. The outgoing pastor, Pastor Barth, had said that the people were bored with preaching, and they fell asleep in the pews. Little did anybody realize that something was about to happen that would galvanize and terrorize the villagers in their faith. A fight with evil in a pretty little house on what is now known as Blumhardtstrasse. And it all began when the Dittus family moved in. The Dittus family already lived in Möttlingen, but it was in February of 1840 when they moved into the ground floor apartment of the ill-fated house. The parents of this family had sadly died young, and so the family that was left consisted of 5 children. That's 2 boys and 3 girls. All 5 of them were unmarried, so they all moved into the ground floor apartment together to make a new home. It was not an easy life for them. Not only were they fairly poor, one of the brothers was half blind. But the town's trauma would end up revolving around the youngest of the siblings, a woman by the name of Gottliebin Dittus. She was born on October the 13th, 1815. She was a talented woman with a knack for writing poetry and songs. The previous pastor, Pastor Barth, had taught her a lot about Christianity, and she was said to have had a very strong foundation in religious faith. She'd worked as a maid in various places and was appreciated for her hard work. However, Gottliebin had a troubled life. Ever since she was a child, she had suffered from a string of strange illnesses, most of which affected her lower abdomen. She was unable to urinate without a medical instrument that the doctor gave her, and she also had issues with her spine. One of her legs was shorter than the other, so walking around was not simple for her. Between 1836 and 38, she'd had kidney disease, which had scared her so much that she had become even more serious about her faith. Perhaps she saw the move to this new ground floor apartment as a fresh start, with God by her side. And yet it was on their very first night in the house when something much darker came to be with her. It was on that first night that the family sat down for a meal. As per their tradition, the eldest brother, Andreas, went to say a prayer of thanks for the food laid out before them. And it was just as Andreas said the following words that all hell broke loose. He said, "Come, Lord Jesus, be our guest." As he spoke those words of the prayer, Gottliebin suddenly stiffened at the table. The report says this:
She immediately rolled her eyes, clasped her hands together, and fell to the ground.
Shocked at her fall, her siblings leapt up and gathered around her. They assumed that she had simply fainted. But when they turned her head and looked at her face, they were horrified. Her expression was ghoulish. It had warped into an intense distortion with open eyes that were unfocused on anything. It was like she was looking at nothing. Now, at this stage of the report, I just kept thinking, oh my goodness, this poor woman, she's just having some sort of seizure, and there was nothing supernatural or demonic about that. But that's not where it stopped. You see, as she lay there on the floor with her face twisting into this grotesque mask, the knocking began. It was a faint tapping at first. I could hear it in the walls. But then the knocking grew louder and louder still, and the family were totally confused as to where it was coming from. Now, yes, there was a family living upstairs, so surely it must be them knocking. And the knocking was moving. Yes, it was on the ceiling sometimes, but then it would switch back to the walls, and then they heard it moving along the floor, where Gottliebin still lay in agony. It was as if something was underneath the floorboards, hammering to get up. And then the banging started to happen on the furniture itself.
An eerie knocking traveled from the walls to the ceiling until it was everywhere.
The family, with Gottliebin lying there, just sat frozen with fear. And they said that as the knocking continued, the candles in the room started to flicker wildly. But listen to this. It wasn't just the wind that was blowing the candles. Johann wrote that the shadows that these candles cast on the walls of the house seemed to act strangely. The family told him that the shadows from these candles were moving independently of the candle, as if there were figures moving in the room around them, like the shadows were figures in their own right. It didn't end there either, because then the floor of the house started to tremble, just slightly, but enough to affect the table with all of the meal placed on it, and the plates started shaking. And then they all felt something physically pushing at them, like a weight was pressing into each of their bodies. But then, at this point, Gottliebin suddenly sat upright, gasped for air, and the words she said were disturbing. She said,
"Something is here. It does not want us to pray."
After the horrendous incident at the dinner table, Gottliebin continued to suffer. She'd have fevers one moment, chills the next. At times she would lie down utterly motionless, and she would keep this position for hours and hours at a time. Her siblings would watch her, worried that she literally might have died in front of them and that they were looking at her corpse, but then they would see slim evidence of breath, which came out shallow and uneven. Others beyond the family witnessed this too, and in his report, Johann said that it was
as though something unnatural had taken hold of her body.
But it wasn't just her condition that shook the others. The distressing poltergeist activity continued. Whenever they would pray in the home, the temperature of the room would plummet. They'd also hear an eerie rustling sound coming from the walls, as if something was moving against it, sliding against the wall. Now, this was an unfamiliar house to them. They'd just moved in. So at first, some of the siblings tried hard to explain all these knockings as being just the house's structure. But no, as Johann puts it,
soon it became impossible to ignore. It grew louder, sharper, more insistent, echoing through the rooms even when the family sat in silence.
The knocking even would come from inside the wooden beams themselves. One of the nights, the knocking was so loud that it seemed to shake the entire house, and during that moment, Gottliebin suddenly began to manifest behavior that was far more worrying. Apparently, as the loud pounding continued, she would let out very deep groans that were described as unnatural, and then her body started to tense horribly, her limbs began to shake, and then
her lips curled back, and with a violent shudder, she expelled a thick, foamy substance from her mouth. Those who witnessed it later said that it was as though something unseen has been forced from her body.
At night, she would find her own hands being forcibly crossed over her own chest, as if an invisible presence was pressing them there. She became, as Johann puts it,
unpleasant and inexplicable in her behavior. There was something repelling about her, an uncanny quality that many people found off-putting.
And so now the Dittus brothers and sisters knew the time had come to seek help. So far, the family had tried to keep their sister's condition private. However, it was in the autumn of 1841 when her nightly torments had reached such an extreme level that Gottliebin finally agreed to meet with Johann, the reverend at the parsonage. He greeted her and was ready to help. However, during that meeting, she still didn't share the full truth of what was going on, and so they ended up just discussing her general struggles. And as a result, Johann, who wasn't aware of all of this poltergeist activity and whatnot, well, he couldn't really understand what her issues were, and he wasn't able to offer a great deal of advice. But then, in December of 1841, she was struck with yet another ailment. This time, she developed a severe skin infection on her face called erysipelas. This is a fairly common bacterial infection of the upper layer of the skin. These days, it can be cleared up with antibiotics. Back then, it could be deadly. And she was described as critically ill with this infection, and this lasted all the way until February of 1842. And so during this time, Johann would visit her at home. She was a member of his parish. She was gravely ill. He wanted to make sure she was okay. But he's quite frank in the report about his feelings towards this woman. He said,
"During this entire illness, I rarely visited her because her behavior repelled me."
You see, when he walked in, she would twist her head away from him, refused to answer his greeting. When he suggested prayer, she would put her hands together, but once he actually started to pray, she would pull her hands apart as if in defiance, Interestingly, Johann was told by the family that before and after his visits, she behaved normally, but whenever he was in the house, she acted in ways that, well, he described as
stubborn, self-righteous, and spiritually arrogant.
He started to feel that she despised his visits so much that he chose to stay away. But he was keen that she got the medical help she needed, which was just as well, because that worked and she recovered from that illness, thankfully. Now, up until this time, Johann was only aware of Gottliebin's disturbing demeanor. He hadn't been told about the poltergeist activity in the home. Yet it would be in the April of 1842 that he started to see the fuller picture. You see, during that month, Johann received a visit from two of Gottliebin's siblings. They were desperate for advice, and he asked them what the problem was. It was time to tell everything. They admitted that their home was filled with knocking sounds, and that the entire neighborhood was starting to hear them too. Something was going on. But there was another thing that they told the Reverend that day. They told him that Gottliebin had claimed she was seeing a strange woman in the house. Apparently, this woman was a local, or should I say, had been a local. You see, the woman who kept visiting her had died 2 years earlier. The revelation that a departed spirit was in the house was worrying enough, but the manner in which this woman came was spine-chilling. Johann learned that Gottliebin said she would always see the woman in the same place every time. She'd be standing beside her bed. She even knew the name of this woman specifically. But there was one other awful detail. The woman by the bed was holding something in her arms each time. A child. A dead child. Gottliebin said that the woman with the dead child in her arms would just stand there watching her. But sometimes at certain shivery moments, the woman would choose to slowly advance closer to the bed, stepping towards Gottliebin. When she did that, this dead woman would speak. And she would say the following.
I just want some peace. Give me a piece of paper and I will not return.
The siblings shared all this with Johann, and after it was out, they asked if Gottliebin should try to communicate further with this ghost. Johann was shocked at this suggestion and just shook his head. He says under no circumstances should she engage with this apparition. Now he writes that he was open to the idea of this spectre being a product of Gottliebin's imagination. But he was also convinced that if she or anyone else were to engage in any kind of conversation with the spirit world, for him, he said it would lead to a horrifying madness. Instead, his advice was that Gottliebin pray earnestly, and in time he just felt the matter would resolve itself. Not quite. After this conversation, Johann made a special request. He asked if a friend of the family would be willing to sleep in the room with Gottliebin. That way she could be looked after and watched. He especially thought that this poor young woman needed support because one of the sisters now worked away from the house while the brother wasn't around much, and frankly, one of the other sisters, wasn't much help either. So the friend did indeed come to stay, and on the night this occurred, the friend started to hear the faint knocking sound, and she saw a very faint shimmer of light glowing softly in the room, and this light moved across the room and seemed to guide the friend under one of the beds in that room. And so the friend crouched down to see what was under there, and she found a piece of paper which was half covered in soot. And it was so covered in that stuff that it was impossible to read, but it was definitely there. And as well as the paper, there were several small coins, including 3 silver crowns. Each of these coins were wrapped in paper, but when they unwrapped the coins, they found that the paper around the coins had soot inside of those too. What was going on? Some wondered if the writing on the paper may be a kind of spell. A couple of weeks later, another light was seen in the house. They followed that one to discover more items buried in the floor, small bones, and more powder wrapped in paper squares. They sent these powders off to the nearby town of Kalf, where scientific analysis was done on them, but there was nothing unusual about them. But this didn't stop Johann from taking all of these found objects and burning them. Doing so did not stop the activity. It made it much, much worse. The knocking and banging became unbearable. It had previously happened at nighttime, but now the pounding was going on through the day too. Locals would literally walk past the house and stop in shock at the racket coming from inside the home, sometimes when there wasn't even anyone in the house at all. And the knocking sounds were at their worst, however, when Gottliebin was present. On one occasion, multiple witnesses saw a table in the house make a knocking sound, but then it shook violently, rose up, and slammed down in front of the horrified onlookers. The news of the haunting and possible possession of Gottliebin Dittus started spreading beyond the village. And when nearby towns heard the news, they would come along to see this house out of sheer morbid curiosity. Johann was worried that all of this would cause a public hysteria, so he arranged a secret night investigation at the house. He invited a sizable group of witnesses to join him. 6 to 8 respected townsmen came, Moses Stanger, a relative of the Dittus family, and last but not least, the actual mayor of Möttlingen. They all arrived at 10 o'clock on the night of June the 3rd, 1842. And as soon as Johann entered the house, they all heard 2 massive pounding sounds from the bedroom. Then more hammering came, only this time in rapid succession. It was like whatever was making those sounds was either furious or excited to see the Reverend arrive with his posse. There were so many witnesses that night that they were scattered all around the house, including upstairs in the other apartment, outside the house. And after a while of all of this banging, they convened on the lower floor and confirmed with each other, "We definitely are hearing that sound, and we cannot figure out where it's coming from." Now, you have to appreciate how loud these sounds were. We're not talking like a knuckle against wood or even a foot slamming into a wall. The report takes pains to emphasize the volume, saying that distant villagers said,
"It sounded like a New Year's gun salute."
For the next 3 hours, these terrified witnesses would see a flurry of shocking activity. They saw a chair simply leap into the air, like someone underneath had kicked it up and away. The windows of the house rattled without anybody touching them, and then, this is weird, a substance started to pour from the ceiling, and when they looked at it closely, they discovered it was sand. At 1 a.m., Gottliebin said she could see that figure again in the house. Well, eventually exhausted, they all decided to call it a night, but not before Johann arranged for Gottliebin to be relocated in another house to keep her safe. Yet just because Gottliebin had left the house didn't mean the activity stopped. Her half-blind brother stayed behind, and he said many frightening things happened to him in the house that night after the others had gone, though the report doesn't go into detail what they were. Well, during these investigations, it was becoming apparent that even though the pounding sound would move around the house, it would often seem to settle on a certain part of the floor. And so, on that afternoon of the Friday, it was decided that they would dig where the sound had been heard most. The floorboards were loose, so they pretty easy to yank them up. And the young man who was there last night, the relative, Mo Stanger, he started digging into the soil. And as his fingers sank into the dirt, he jerked his hand back as a small flame flickered up from the ground. The flame vanished, and so they risked digging more and found inside more squares of paper with powder wrapped inside them, more coins, and they also found a weird pot, which had another pot on top of it upside down like a lid. And when they took this pot lid off, they found that the first pot was filled with earth and bones. This caused a chill to race through the onlookers because there had now at this point been a rumor spreading around the village. People knew full well about this ghost that Gottliebin was seeing, and they were whispering in the dark corners of the village that this was the spirit of a local child killer. And that's why she'd been carrying the body of a child, not cradling a loved one, but holding on to a victim. The locals were frightened to find these bones, especially when they were examined by a gravedigger who confirmed it. He said, "These are the bones of a child." As you might imagine, this was starting to push the community into a state of near hysteria. And so to try and quell the panic, Johann gathered up the bones along with the other items, and he took them to Kalf. The mayor of the village agreed to go with him. They handed everything to a doctor called Dr. Kaiser, the doctor of the district. He had helped Gottliebin before. What the doctor said came as some relief to Johann and the mayor. These were not the bones of a child. They were the bones of a bird. That was, of course, encouraging that these were not human remains, and yet the ritualistic nature of these bird bones led them to just another distressing conclusion. He wrote,
"At some point, black magic must have been practiced here. And now the restless spirits of the dead had become drawn back the home in which these rituals were performed."
At this point, Johann just wanted to bring an end to the fear and confusion in the locals, so he made some arrangements for Gottliebin to stay with a female cousin of hers. And then after that, she moved in with her uncle, Johann Georg Stanger, who I guess is the father of Mo Stanger. Johann made the Stanger family promise total secrecy so that Gottliebin would at least get some peace while the chaos died down. He was particularly worried that all of this activity might lead locals to believe that Gottliebin was possessed by the devil. At this point, he wasn't sure if that was the case at all. In fact, he feared for her safety if that was to be believed. It was good they got her out of the house for now, because outsiders were now flocking to this place. His report says that some even begged him to be allowed to stay in that house for the night. Yes, we might think that back in the 1840s, people might be way more superstitious and resistant to the experience of the paranormal, but just like many people today, those people were just like us. They were desperate to witness these events for themselves. Indeed, on one night, Johann was approached by 3 Catholic priests. They traveled from the neighboring region of Baden, and they, too, asked if they could spend a few hours in the haunted room. They and all the other Gawkers were turned away by Johann, and the house was kept tightly secured. It helped that the town watchman just happened to live across the street. But then, still in 1842, Johann got news that the paranormal activity was now happening in the new house where Gottliebin was staying. The knocking, the convulsions were back, but this time, oh my goodness, this time, there were far more spectacles, hideous spectacles to come. On one Sunday, Johann was visiting Gottliebin in the new house, along with several of her female friends. He said it was a dreadful experience because they all just sat there watching as horrific convulsions took over her body. He had put his seat far away, but even from where he'd sat in that room, he could clearly see her body twisting and contorting in ways that were simply not possible, he said.
She wrenched her arms in unnatural angles. Her head bent sideways at an extreme position, her torso arched upward, straining against an invisible force, and foam poured once again from her mouth.
Now, I appreciate this all sounds like the script of a modern horror movie, but this is taken directly from Johann's centuries-old written report. Indeed, the physician had been in to visit, and he witnessed this, and he said, "I've never seen anything like this in my life." Up until this point, Johann had been cautious about using the word demonic, but as he watched these extreme contortions, he thought, I don't know if this is just an illness. It feels like there is a malignant presence in this room, what with all of the other evidence, the moving furniture, the banging, the weird stuff going on. So as he sat there watching, and the girls sat watching, helpless, he'd had enough of feeling powerless. He leapt up from his chair, raced towards Gottliebin, and he grabbed her hands, which were stiff and cold with the convulsions, and he forced them together, acting far more forcefully than he ever had before, and he shouted at her. He shouted this.
Gottliebin, put your hand together and pray. Lord Jesus, help me. We have seen enough of what the devil can do. Now let us see what Jesus can do.
Within seconds of him saying that, apparently Gottliebin woke from her state and all the convulsions stopped, and she repeated his prayer word for word. The witnesses in the room were absolutely stunned by this. She seemed at peace, but that peace would not last long. Because back at home, Johann was sitting when a messenger rushed to his door, saying that after a peaceful evening, Gottliebin had fallen into her worst convulsions yet. He rushed back, and when he did, he said her demeanor was utterly monstrous. This episode lasted about 3 hours until a prayer finally managed to calm her down. Then, at 9 p.m. the next evening, it all started again. Johann wrote that whenever she looked at him, her eyes would bulge wide and wild, glaring at him in what he described as a
dreadful expression.
She started to make threatening movements towards him. She would claw towards his face. She admitted that she was trying to get at his eyes. She wanted to gouge them out with her bare hands. He just kept praying, and she was never actually able to lay her hands on him. And since she couldn't grab him, she would just slam her hands on the bed in anger. If Johann had any doubts that he was battling with some kind of evil spirit, he lost them with what happened next. Because this is when the demon began to speak. He was with Gottliebin again with a scattering of other witnesses. Remember that he insisted that there would always be other people present to observe and confirm what he was seeing. Frankly, in reading the report, I think he was paranoid that people were going to think less of him and call him crazy for his claims, so he wanted others to back him up. So he just sat there with others, and Gottliebin was laying there in a fairly normal state, but then something seemed to enter her. Her body began to writhe. And in response, Johann started to pray in the name of Jesus, which is when Gottliebin's eyes suddenly rolled into the back of her head, and she spoke in a voice that shocked the people in the room, because it wasn't her voice, and yet it came out of her mouth. It said,
I cannot bear to hear that name.
Johann's description of how the witnesses responded to this new voice is simple yet chilling. He writes that when they all heard it,
everybody shuddered together.
Johann did not assume that this was the devil speaking or a demon, but rather he suspected that this was the dead woman who had been visiting Gottliebin, the one carrying the dead child. So he decided to confront this woman, and he began to interrogate her. The report includes the following exchange.
Can't you rest in peace in your grave?
No.
Well, why not?
This is how I have to pay for my sins.
Did you not confess all your sins to me?
No. I murdered 2 children and buried them in a field.
Can't you find a way to help yourself? Can't you pray?
I can't pray.
Don't you know Jesus, who forgives all sins?
Duh. I cannot stand that name.
Are you alone?
No.
Who's with you?
The most terrible one.
This most terrible one may well be a reference to the devil himself. Johann said the conversation lasted a long time and that the voice confessed to practicing witchcraft, which had somehow bound it to the devil, in his opinion. Johann asked if he could pray for this entity, this demon, whatever it was. And after a moment of hesitation, the voice agreed. So he did pray for it, telling it that it could not remain in Gottliebin. And at this point, this voice became sad and sorrowful, begging to be allowed to stay, and then demanding to stay. And so sternly he told it to leave. Gottliebin slammed her hands on the bed, and then suddenly she was back to her normal self. These possession episodes carried on, and by Johann's reckoning, he was seeing multiple entities, and he started to call them demons after a while, speaking through Gottliebin. She was violent too. Not towards Johann directly, because it seemed impossible for her to actually reach him, but she did attack others who were present, even laying a few blows and punches on the mayor. She also would attack herself. She would drag at her own hair. She would punch herself, and a rather horrible image to have in your mind, but she would smash her head against the wall. It was just a horrendous scene. Johann was getting desperate and even started to fear that his contributions were just making this all worse. And his friends were seeing the toll that was taking on him, and they begged him, "You've got to walk away from this." And as tempting as that was, he refused. He was just too scared of what would become of Gottliebin if he abandoned her. And he was also open in the report and saying that he was worried for himself. What would people think of him? The community might blame him for it if he left her. He felt a deep sense of shame too, that even in the midst of all these proofs of the supernatural, he was wondering, where the hell was God in the midst of this? Why did she have to suffer so much and in such a degrading, painful way? And it really did get worse. Much worse. He estimated that there were 14 demons in her at this point, but then the number increased to 175, and then 425, and the numbers kept going up. It was exhausting. And there were so many different encounters in that room with Gottliebin and all these different demons. He admits in the report that it just became like harder and harder to remember the details of each one. He said that after a while, it all just started blending into one long, waking, relentless nightmare. The supernatural elements continued too. On one of the nights, Gottliebin said she could see a large group of spectral figures gathering around the bed, watching her. But this time, there was a witness to those figures too. There was a woman attending, and she too was horrified when she saw these figures leering over Gottliebin. Just like she had said, it was getting terrifying. Especially when incidents would happen, like Gottliebin waking from sleep suddenly when she felt a red-hot, burning hand grasping her throat, and the appalled witnesses could see the burn marks forming on her neck right in front of them. They called the doctor in, and he was, quote, utterly astonished. Gottliebin wasn't confined to her bed the entire time, by the way. Sometimes in her more quiet moments, she would go out into the town for fresh air. I'm sure passers-by might have considered crossing the street to avoid this poor woman, especially when she would sometimes collapse on the pathway, falling and screaming that something had grabbed her ankles. And she would just lie there writhing like a worm. Johann was devastated watching her decline, and it began to break his heart, especially when Gottliebin was starting to say that she was longing for death. During the possession, she had a moment of clarity when she cried out to him,
For God's sake, I do not want this.
It was pitiful. There's a really eerie moment when she reached out and grabbed a rope that was nearby her bed, and before anyone could do anything, she leapt up and quickly wrapped this rope around the beam. She formed a loop, and as they no doubt pleaded for her to stop, she forced her head through that loop. But then a flash of lightning hit outside, which caught her eye, and it seemed to bring her back to her senses, and she stopped. Now, you might be asking, as I did, why on earth would they keep a rope near a woman in her condition? Well, in his report, Johann asked the same question. He quizzed people. What are you doing with this rope? Where did this rope come from? Nobody could answer this, including Gottliebin. I think this is really creepy. It was like the rope had appeared out of nowhere simply to facilitate her tying it to the beam. Not only that, they marveled at how well and how fast she tied the loop on the rope, and everyone said, that is not a skill Gottliebin has. But in her state, she was so deft and swift at tying it. It was like something was helping her get the rope, helping her tie it up, so that she could do it quickly and efficiently. It's just really insidious to think about. Later at 8 p.m. that night, a storm was raging and Johann returned to check on her. When he found her in bed, he was horrified. She lay there covered in blood. It had soaked through her clothes, all across her upper body, and all she could say to him was,
The figures. The figures.
So he prayed and she screamed. And while a horrible voice came out of her in manic, evil laughter, he just kept on praying. This seemed to infuriate this demon, and Johann writes that
the full force of the demon's rage and despair broke loose, and many terrifying cries were heard, mostly in a wailing, lamenting voice.
This is what the demon said.
Now, everything is lost. Everything is betrayed. You're completely ruining us. The entire pact is breaking apart. Everything is over. Everything is falling into confusion. You are to blame with your endless praying. You are truly casting us out. Whoa. Everything is lost. There are 1,067 of us, and of those who are still alive, there are many more. They have signed their names in blood. With the devil. With the devil. With the devil. With the devil.
Johann writes powerfully of the sheer horror of that moment. He said that the howling of the demons, the flashing of lightning outside, the rolling thunder, the torrential rain hammering the house, and the solemn shock of all the people present and listening to this, mixed with the sound of his prayers, he said all of these details combined to create a scene that he felt was impossible to convey in words. No amount of imagination, he insisted, could ever come close to the reality of that moment during that storm-battered night of August 1842. Well, Gottliebin continued to see these figures, and some of them would plead through her, asking Johann for permission to attend his church services. They said they wanted to be free of evil as well, and so he agreed to allow some of them to come to church. So when Gottliebin attended the church services with Johann in the pulpit, she told him she could see the figures appearing in the church too. Only they weren't surrounding her. She watched them crowding around the pulpit that were trying to get at Johann while he preached. He actually said that he didn't see these figures, but he had this sense that something might be happening, something frightening during his preaching, but if anything, it made him feel bolder rather than scared. The rest of the report goes into details about the types of conversations he had with these demonic entities, with many of them moving from defiance to tear-filled pleading to not be cast into the abyss of hell. Some of the demons spoke about their origins too. A few even claimed to have come from America. And then, on February the 8th, 1843, Gottliebin told Johann that while she was in one of her trances, she had an intense experience that might sound more like a nightmare, but Johann had reason to think it was real. Listen to this.
It was as if she were carried away by someone with extraordinary speed over land and sea, hovering above the surface. She flew over many countries and cities, passed by ships on the sea, clearly seeing their crew and hearing them speak audibly until, finally, arriving at the high mountain, upon whose summit she was placed. Some details led me to guess the West Indies.
While on this island, she was taken to the summit of a mountain with a large opening in it. Fire and smoke were billowing out. All around her, she could see cities and villages in the valley collapsing with dust billowing up into the air. While this was happening, she watched the demons that had tormented her most being cast into the fire of the mountain. She watched about 1,000 of them thrown into the flames, and she said that every single one of them, before it was thrown in, rushed at her, trying to grab her so they could drag her down with them. But they never touched her, and she watched them sink into the inferno, and when they were gone, she was once again carried at the same impossible speed across the mountains and sea and back to her home in Germany. Was this just a hallucination, a dream, a vision, or was she somehow actually taken to that mountaintop? Well, Johann writes this rather startling element in his report.
I cannot vouch for what she recounted here, of course. However, I was exceedingly astonished and surprised when, shortly afterward, the newspapers reported the terrible earthquake that had occurred on February 8th in the West Indies. The descriptions from the Moravian mission reports, which I read aloud in a mission hour, completely transported Gottliebin back into what she had seen in the spirit.
Now and then the demons would announce that they were causing droughts and floods around the world because they were just so angry that they were being expelled from Gottliebin. These horrible voices would also chant out the words, blood, blood, blood. And sometimes they would shout fire, fire as well, because they seemed not only desperate for blood, but the whole village to be burned down. And here's a really eerie detail in the report. Johann remembered that on one occasion, when the demons were chanting and hissing their desire for blood, they said, blood, even if it's just sheep. This frightened Johann, because a flock of sheep in the village had been thrown into a great chaos because a mysterious and never-seen-before dog appeared to terrorize that flock. The shepherds tried to calm that sheep down. They couldn't. The next morning, they found 2 of those sheep had been torn apart by the dog. And where did they find the sheep's bodies? Strewn under the window of Johann's house. Had the demons somehow gotten out into the village and killed for blood, even if it was just sheep's blood? Such was their desperation, as they said. But really, as horrible as all this was, the physical terror had only just begun. And maybe this is where you need to prepare yourself, because what I'm about to share with you is disturbing and really quite gruesome. In 1843, Gottliebin began vomiting up strange objects, like sand, shards of glass. They even found bent iron nails, shoe buckles in her vomit. And then the metal objects got larger. The witnesses just stood there in disbelief at how such big metal items could even fit into her throat as they came up. Sometimes these things were so big that she would stop breathing entirely as it slowly made its way up her mouth. And then there were the needles, countless in number, falling from her mouth. Sewing needles, broken knitting needles, pins, sometimes one at a time. At other times they were bundled together with paper and feathers. At one point, some needles, about the length of a finger, came out of her ear. Listen to this. horrendous sentence from the report. Johann said,
Another time I could both feel and hear the needles breaking and turning inside her head when I laid hands on her.
He even said that he had to remove needles from her eyes after he saw them moving underneath her eyelids. So many came out of her upper and lower jaw that it caused her excruciating tooth pain. During this time, they examined the inside of her mouth, and he saw 2 long wires that had somehow woven into the skin of her tongue. He said it took him and his wife nearly an hour to remove these wires, and Gottliebin lost consciousness during the extraction. Not surprised. Johann was fully aware that this all sounded like something from a twisted fairy tale, which is why he insisted on having all of these people present at all times, and they were able to confirm a particularly mysterious element of these needles and things coming out of her. They said despite the countless wounds on her body, as the needles came out, they didn't produce blood. Even when they pulled needles from her skin, there was just a slight mark left, no serious wound. Now, you might think it's impossible for this to get any more disturbing, but it does. Eventually, as well as her vomiting up all manner of inanimate objects, the witnesses started to see living things crawling out of her. Now, it's important to note that he writes in his report that he never personally saw the living things came. He saw loads of pins and stuff, but he didn't see the living things. But he was assured by others who attended that this absolutely happened. For example, on one occasion, she expelled 4 enormous locusts from her body. And they were very much alive because when those present set the locusts outside, they saw them hopping around in the grass outside. Other witnesses said that she even vomited up larger animals like toads, even bats. And perhaps most disturbing of all for Johann was when Gottliebin claimed that a mysterious serpent, like a viper, had suddenly slid up through her throat, across her lips and out into the room, slithering away into the shadows. Gottliebin announced this had happened before anyone else had seen it, but Johann did write at the time that he did think he saw a fast-moving streak of light coming out of her mouth and vanishing into the bed. They checked her over after this and they found a mysterious wound on her neck. Did it bite her? And how disturbing to think that where one person saw light, another person saw a physical creature. Just imagine for a moment that the lights people see in hauntings or orbs, if you will, whatever you want to call it, these lights that come, what if they're not lights? What if they're living creatures moving through space? But if there was one incident that would reach the peak of terror, it was the Day of the Blood. At the beginning of December 1843, the nosebleeds came. These nosebleeds would start and not stop. Every time she had one, the blood from her nose would fill an entire bowl to the brim, and then they just get a new bowl, and it just kept pouring. The witnesses were astonished that she survived the loss of so much blood. And they also remarked on how odd the blood seemed. It was very, very dark, almost black, and it had this horrendous smell. But it got worse. And one afternoon, Johann was on his way to visit some of his congregation when he decided to pop in to check on Gottliebin, see how she was doing. She was pointing at her head, saying,
Here in my head. Can you see this? Here. Something is lodged here. If it doesn't come out, I will die.
Well, he examined the area of her head she was talking about. He found nothing unusual, so he said, look, I have to leave to continue my visits. And so the doctor came instead, a doctor called Dr. Spaeth, and he stayed with her for 2 hours. He examined her and he started to notice there were some hard spots developing where she had pointed to on her scalp, and he was convinced something very significant was about to happen. But then he got called to a birth in a nearby place called Simmersheim, so he had to leave. Well, it was eventually 4 a.m. when Johann eventually got back to the village, and he was walking through the village when he suddenly, in the darkness, saw a local running in the distance towards him. And this local was in panic, and he was shouting, Pastor, it's urgent, it's urgent. And so he ran too, and the both of them hurried back to Gottliebin's house. And he wrote that that familiar stench of black blood was so great that he almost staggered away from the house and the face of it. But he rushed through and went in. And what he saw was, he wrote,
the most horrific sight I had ever witnessed.
Gottliebin was sitting in the middle of the small room with a bucket in front of her. It was half filled with blood and water, and he could see a long and wide trail of blood stretching across the floor behind her. She was drenched in blood, and the reason was plain to see. He said as he and the other witnesses looked on in horror and disgust, they saw blood gushing from her ears, her nose, her eyes, and even spurting out of the top of her scalp. And they were coming from the very points where the doctor had found those hard areas emerging earlier. The commotion of this moment was so intense that people were hanging out of the windows in the street, looking on in fear and curiosity as people staggered out of the Dittus home in fear and horror. This is 4 a.m. in the morning, remember. Looking at this, Johann said he was just completely at a loss as to what to do. This gruesome spectacle simply floored him. He did the only thing he could do, really. He gathered the strength to pray, and the bleeding did stop. And so he ordered her to be cleaned up, and her body was examined. They found a bent nail, an iron nail, a small one, pushing its way out of her forehead, just above the eyebrows. He felt around the back of her head, and he could feel something else. It was still twisting under her skin. Soon after, they all watched a wooden nail emerging from the back of her head. And after that, the bleeding stopped completely. Well, as the days went on, Johann and others frantically tried to work out how could this possibly be happening. Gottliebin herself said that she must be bewitched, and she wondered if the food she was eating had been cursed in some way. She thought this because she was eating a meal with chicken one day when she started to suspect there was something wrong with the meal, and so she fed it to a bird outside. This bird went into an instant frenzy and died. Now, she claimed she took a knife and cut the bird's head open and its throat and found it was crammed with shoe nails. Was she telling the truth here, or was this some weird and twisted ruse from the demon inside her? Who can tell? But with all that they had seen, it was hard for people not to believe what she was saying. She also claimed that these strange ghosts that she'd been seeing in the house may have been putting these objects inside her. Remember when she said the figures gathered around the bed? And some of the attendants even saw those figures too. Well, Gottliebin said that these spirits would sometimes have stuff in their hands, objects, like bread, for example. And as she lay there, they would place the bread into her mouth, or they would touch other parts of her body. She said the nails in particular must be coming from a man who she saw dressed as a clergyman. She was out in the street one night when she was walking, and this man, this clergyman-looking man, walked up to her with nails in his hands and thrust nails into her head. She was sure that this man was not a living person, but some sort of apparition or demonic entity. There were many other examples of this, and they led Johann to believe that Gottliebin may well be the victim of some sort of sorcery, but he felt it wasn't from living practitioners. He felt that these were dead people who were practicing the actual rites, but they were somehow using living people to gather the materials. It's quite a theory. But he also wanted to be very cautious with this angle too. In fact, it is encouraging in his report that he makes a point of criticizing the witch trials of previous centuries, saying that the torturing of people to make them confess witchery was utterly misguided and dangerous. Indeed, he flat out refused to even entertain any accusation of any person about witchcraft. He certainly felt that turning this into a witch hunt would give Satan exactly what he wanted, to sow deceit and death and division and destruction. But why did this force target Gottliebin? Well, Johann felt it might have something to do with the events of her childhood, because as he got to know her and heard more about her history, he learned that Gottliebin's mother had died 10 years before, but while she was alive, she would often talk about a shocking incident from when Gottliebin was a baby. Soon after she was born, her mother placed her new baby next to her in bed. But while she was asleep, she woke with a sense of dreadful fear, and when she turned to check, her fear was realized. Her new baby, Gottliebin, was gone. She cried out in terror, "Lord Jesus, my child," frantically searching for the baby. Then suddenly she heard the sound of something hitting the floor, and when she looked over, the baby was lying there. This happened not once, but twice. Johann was almost embarrassed to suggest this in the report, but he just wondered, could this be linked to those old folk beliefs of changeling children, where dark forces kidnap babies and leave substitutes while initiating the real kids into dark magic? Or was this somehow related to Gottliebin's aunt? He wondered. She was supposedly feared by the entire community, and she always had promised Gottliebin that she would teach her something truly powerful and remarkable when she turned 10. Yet the aunt died when Gottliebin was only 8 years old. What was this power she was speaking of? Johann even learned, and this is heartbreaking, he even learned that when she was a small child, Gottliebin had repeatedly thought of ending it all. Even then, at one point she went into the woods with a neck scarf, and she gathered stones to build a platform. And then she tied the scarf around a tree, raised it up high, and climbed onto the stones. She put her head through and then stepped off, but the scarf tore and she tumbled to the ground. And this snapped her out of a trance that she realized, I did not intentionally want to do what I just did. So it was particularly eerie when later in the exorcism, one of those demons called out,
"Why won't the girl die? The scarf had to tear."
as if it was frustrated that she hadn't died. Well, the final battle eventually came during the Christmas of 1843. By then, it wasn't even just Gottliebin displaying these shocking behaviors, but her half-blind brother and her sister Katharina were also showing signs of possession. In his report, Johann doesn't give a lot of details about these final confrontations, simply because he said he was just getting too overwhelmed with writing it all down. The recall was becoming too disturbing for him to cope with, and the minute details impossible to retain because his survival mechanisms were coming up and blotting them out. But he does say that in that final battle, the horror especially did seem to leap to the sister Katharina. She hadn't shown any signs of possession before, but now she was acting like she was violently insane. She even tried to tear Johann to pieces and so had to be physically restrained. And when she roared and screamed, it was like 1,000 wicked voices crying out of her mouth at the same time. The final exorcism took place at midnight, in a flurry of unearthly screams and shrieks of despair. He said the entire house shook, with sounds so loud half of the village huddled in their homes, terrified. But then, at around 2 a.m., something changed. Katharina arched her back and twisted her body into a horribly unnatural posture, but from her voice came the words, "Jesus is victor, Jesus is victor." This cry was shockingly loud at first, but then it kept going on and gradually dying down, and the demon's voice grew quieter and quieter over the remaining hours of that night. And after about 6 hours of this gradual reduction, the voice was completely gone by 8 a.m. And this is where the 2-year battle finally ended. And something told Johann that he could be certain of this ending. Yes, any remaining activity was just an echo of a cast-out squatter, but the worst of it all was over. As for Gottliebin, her ordeal had been monumental. But when she came out of it, an unexpected positive came about. All of her previous medical issues, from her shorter leg, her spinal issues, her chronic stomach disorders, they had all vanished. Gottliebin went on to become a cherished member of the church and community and actually went to work for Johann and his wife as their house manager and childminder. Johann said that this was a testament to the change in her, that he and his wife would trust her so implicitly with their home and children, this woman who had previously wanted nothing more than to gouge out his eyes with her bare hands. Gottliebin would become an important source of counsel and advice for the Reverend when he was dealing with members of the community who were suffering with mental health issues. Her insight into these struggles was a valuable asset, he said. Despite her trauma, maybe especially because of it, he felt that she had lived up to her name as a shining example. Gottliebin means both the one that loves God and the one loved by God. And with a clear sense of admiration and respect for all she had been through, those fiery furnace flames, and the gold had come out. Johann writes this of Gottliebin Dittus.
She had endured the fires of affliction and emerged victorious.
For me, this has been one of the most intense and disturbing possessions I've researched. The elements are incredibly gruesome and grotesque, and I can understand why many viewers might dismiss this as pure fiction. Indeed, reading the report back today, frankly, it sounds like it's filled with modern horror movie cliches, and to be honest, if this had been written in 2025, I think I'd just go, it's just a bunch of horror tropes thrown into one. But it wasn't written today. The final sign-off of Johann's report is July the 31st, 1850. That's quite startling, I think. But yes, it's a lot to take in, and Johann knew this too. In fact, one thing struck me as the team and I worked through the translation of the report was that he was very worried about sharing this because when he had told his friends previously and his colleagues, they struggled to get their head around this stuff. Some of them disbelieved, others were too shocked. Some of them, interestingly, were worried that they would become infested by the demonic presence just by hearing about it. And so Johann admits that he held back a lot of the horror, but his superiors encouraged him to write it all down. He found it hard and draining, and he kept wondering if he should censor it to make it more palatable. He's quite open about worrying that people might think badly of him for talking like this. But he said that every time he thought that, he had a sense of a voice in his head saying, no, out with it, out with it. In fact, he wrote this.
I cannot take it amiss if somebody is mistrustful of these accounts, for these things are beyond our understanding. They are, however, based on observations and experiences over nearly 2 years, ones which can in every case can be corroborated by eyewitnesses.
I also find it quite interesting that he didn't particularly want this to be widely read. Only 100 copies were produced, and he saw no reason to make any more. And yet the story was so memorable it survives to this day, even to the point of being able to visit the house in which it happened. But before we close, a word of caution. The topic of possession is highly controversial, and stories like this will always divide opinion. Some argue that cases like Gottliebin Dittus are evidences of something supernatural, while others see them as misunderstood medical or psychological conditions. That point is incredibly important, and I cannot overestimate how vital it is for people not to jump to conclusions when it comes to people who are suffering. Even if they are manifesting things that look shocking and horrible, it does not mean that they are possessed by the devil. But beyond the debate, there is a real and serious danger in how these stories are handled. History has shown us that exorcisms can go horribly wrong. I covered a tragic case on my channel where an attempted exorcism ended in death. There are countless examples of this. So this is not a subject to take lightly, and it's why discussions about possessions must be approached with extreme care. I am not an expert on this topic. I am literally just like a journalist presenting this stuff. That said, there is something deeply strange about this case in particular. If this were just a psychological affliction, how do you explain the reported poltergeist activity? The objects that appeared inside her body, the nails and other items seemingly manifesting from nowhere. The things that were thrown around the house. These details push the story beyond a case of misdiagnosed mental illness, suggesting that at the very least something very, very unusual was happening in Möttlingen in those years. But another important caution is Johann Blumhardt. He didn't act alone. Unlike some modern exorcisms that take place in secret or in private, with devastating consequences, he involved the whole community. Medical professionals, church officials, even the local government, mayor. This part of his approach is crucial today. I don't know a great deal about Johann Blumhardt beyond this story, so I don't know if he's an amazing person or not. This is not a comment on me thinking he's amazing at all. I don't know. But reading through his report, I was encouraged that he involved other people. And so for anyone watching this who thinks these sorts of stories are a motivation to seek out possessed people and perform exorcisms on them, it is far more complicated than that and deadly. Perhaps the biggest danger in cases like this isn't the demons, but what society does to those believed to be possessed. In other words, Gottliebin Dittus would have been burned at the stake for this at one point in her life. Instead, she made it through a horrific ordeal and then was welcomed into the community with love and affection. She endured something horrific, something beyond reason, and came out the other side free. But the presences that tormented her and seeped her life with all the colors of the dark made her body its battleground. But did they just disappear? If they were cast out, does that mean they're still out there somewhere? Looking for a one place to call home. I'm Peter Laws, and you've been listening to Nightmare Fuel and the terrifying possession of Gottliebin Dittus. Good night.